Welcome back to Lippincott Talk. My name is Josiah Lippincott. I am your host. Last night, three Zohran Mamdani candidates won their congressional primary races in New York City. It is a remarkable turn of events that indicates, in my mind, just how much the radical turn among younger Democrats is now affecting the party establishment overall. Mamdani was the canary in the coal mine, pointing to a new future for Democrats. And the way I'm frame this is we are seeing Hart-Celler Democrats replace the Ellis Island Democrats. And this is having a major effect on that party, and I think will have a major effect going forward. This radicalization, the turn to socialism, the turn to pro-Palestine, pro-Third Worldist, pro-Global South views is now explicit. And the old consensus in the Democratic Party, which was preference for the least among us, but a kind of, but with a view that Israel, for instance, was part of that framework, that's just done on the left, I think, going forward. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and I don't want to get into all of them here. October 7th has proven to be extremely relevant to Democratic Party politics, and I think will continue to be so in the future. And there's a story to be told there, but the one I want to zero in on today is immigration as such. It's interesting at this very moment when we see the effects that changing demographic and immigration patterns are having on New York City's politics and the nation's politics. Trump is, we're waiting on this decision from the Supreme Court regarding birthright citizenship and whether or not it exists under the 14th Amendment. The whole issue, on the one hand, the legal issues at stake and the constitutional issues at stake are very complicated, and they deal with the understanding of the common law and American natural rights principles and the Revolution and state law and public law. There's all of these complex and legal questions that are bearing on the issue of citizenship in the 14th Amendment case. But as we've seen last night, there's a political dimension to everything that's going on here that's worth examining clearly from first principles. And so my goal here today is to try and present what I think a clearer way of thinking about citizenship could look like. And this is a complex issue. It deserves a careful, concise treatment. And what I'm doing here today is to hopefully push my audience, push those of you listening, and others to engage seriously on this topic. I don't claim to be offering a final presentation of all of my views here today, or to claim that I've worked all of this out. I think that would be presumptuous. But what I am trying to do is to highlight a pathway forward that will hopefully help. And this is for my own edification, hopefully for your own. The question of who is and who is not a citizen is absolutely crucial for any political regime. It is central. It is second only to the question of what is the political regime for? What is its goal? And then right below that is who is a member? To whom does the obligations and benefits of citizenship apply? So the way I've framed this in my mind for what I want to do today is to just ask a series of questions relating to the question of citizenship in order to give my own responses and how I've begun to think through these issues. And I'm also going to talk about some of the research that I've done and where it's led me. And hopefully what I'm doing here today will clarify and sharpen our understanding of what needs to happen going forward as we're dealing with an increasingly destabilized and upended politics and an increasingly divided country. What do we do going forward? How do we preserve peace? How do we have a country? What do these things mean? What is the purpose of law? All of these questions are on the table. We're exposing the foundations, and I think that's important to deal with in a serious way. So the first question I have here is, what does citizenship mean in a free society based on the consent of the governed? And I ask that question because if we want to think about what America is or who belongs, the first place we should go is to the foundation. We should go back to the beginning. And the obvious starting point in that project is to look at the Declaration of Independence. That really, today, this year is the 250th anniversary of American independence. We track our age not from the Constitution, not from the birth of the colonies, but from the Declaration, from the break from Great Britain. That is the origin point of our regime. That's the way we conceive of it now. It's the way we've always thought of that as a people. We've always understood it in those terms. And so the question of, what does citizenship mean in a free society based on the consent of the governed? I think it means, first and foremost, obligation, a willingness to follow the law, and to undertake the necessary actions to preserve that political society. That's what membership means. You have incurred obligations to the society that's been formed. You owe something now, and you get something in return. And moreover, in a free society, that choice is conscious. It is based on consent. You have chosen to be a member. It's crucial. And from that perspective, I think the idea of tacit consent really doesn't work, and it hasn't really worked in American history. This has proven to be a problem, a very serious one. We stumble into citizenship today. The idea is like, well, you're born to citizens and then you're here, so you're a citizen. And that's how we treat it legally. But the problem with that view is it occludes that core question, well, what is it exactly that I owe, and what is it that I'm owed in turn? So right now, American citizenship is mostly viewed by immigrants and by many Americans to simply be a welfare and benefits program. It means you get stuff from other people by leveraging the power of the state for your own interests. And right now, because the left is dominant, the dominant moral view in our society is that the needy, the least among us, the global south, minorities, women, the oppressed, whatever group you want to, the framing is always those people have a right to extract resources through the state. That's the core moral premise that drives the whole aspect of our regime. Everything is oriented towards redistribution and to care for the least among us. So the idea that that should be done by the state. So this isn't charity, right? And in a way, this language about the least among us is parodying, or I think wrongly extracting, biblical teachings about charity and transforming them into moral doctrines for the state to embrace. So I think it's, the idea, we don't have a regime any longer oriented by equality, but we should. And part of the problem is the expectation is straight white men, Christians, heteronormative people, whatever, cisgendered, all of those people owe something to those who are among the disadvantaged. And that moral principle, I think, is at the heart of all of this. And it's the key question we have to grapple with. For the founders, the question of the purpose of the political regime was oriented toward the defense of the person and property of citizens. It's rooted in equality. Citizens then are equal, and the obligations they owe and the rights they receive are more or less equal. There's always been some question in our political regime about what is owed, and this especially comes up in tax policy. Obviously, taxes are, we don't all pay the same amount. Some people pay more, and that question has been fraught from the founding, to be fair. If you look back at the questions about the Whiskey Rebellion, Shays Rebellion, the fight over the tariff, the Hartford Convention during the War of 1812. What you see over and over again is there's a real fight over the different obligations required of citizens in the early American Republic. There's certainly a view that citizens owe something to their political regime, that they should fight for it, they should preserve it, they need to pay taxes, they need to sustain it, they should defend their fellow citizens and uphold their duties. Yet there's a fight over what those duties are. And that was the case at the time of the founding for all kinds of reasons. I think the most important is the question over slavery. That really, I think, had a pernicious effect on our ability to think through clearly what citizenship meant at the time. So one of the things that the scholar Ed Erler points out in his book, The United States in Crisis, Citizenship, Immigration, and the Nation State, and this is true just historically, is the Constitution doesn't define who is a citizen. It leaves it up to the states and for them to define. And there was a lot of complexity on this question at the time of the founding, and there wasn't unanimity among all of the states. The dominant framework, as far as I can tell at the time, and I think this is right, is the social compact view. So at the period of the Revolution, there were loyalists, and there were pro-British and a pro-American faction, the patriots and the loyalists. And the loyalists, the British loyalists who were living in America, many of them moved back to Britain, or they would go to Canada. But there's this question of how do you know whether someone, what choice they made. This would come up especially in discussions about probate law, estates, figuring out inheritance. There were complexities based off of unclear land titles emerging from rules regarding inheritance and citizenship in some of the early American states. And the general view seems to have been there's a period of election where if someone was born in the colonies, but then went back to Britain, joined the British military, went to Canada, and did so within that time frame, then they were understood to have renounced membership in the American political community that was forming during the Revolution. Their old allegiance to Britain was maintained if they left. But if they stayed, then the interpretation in American law was generally that they had decided to be an American, and they owed allegiance to the newly formed American government under the Articles of Confederation, and that they continued to owe allegiance to the state government. The truth is, this question was really complicated at the time of the founding. And from what I can tell, just from a cursory review, is that the standards used, the question of how long the period of election was, it was not always the same. And so, for instance, in Massachusetts, in a case there, Ainsley v. Martin, Theophilus Parsons, who's actually a really good expositor on the social compact theory, essentially embraces, I think, the older common law view of birth in the Commonwealth, birth being the driver of citizenship. And so his interpretation of that case flows from the idea that the Massachusetts colony inherited authority and sovereignty from the British regime after the Revolution. In other places, that was not so clear. And there's, a number of cases, Inglis versus Snug Harbor, and then there's a case in New Jersey, McIlvaine v. Cox's lessee, where these questions occur, and it's questions of, again, the period of election. It's different between different states. That's what also comes out in some of these cases. And, whether or not someone leaving, when and exactly how someone renounced their citizenship. The one that's interesting to me is the McIlvaine versus Cox's lessee, because the gentleman, Daniel Cox, he left New Jersey after they had passed the law. He left New Jersey to go back to Britain, and he was clearly manifested, I think, an intention to be a British citizen. But he left after the state legislature passed acts regarding whether or not you owed allegiance if you stayed or went. So the period of election, in that case, is very, very limited and narrow during the Revolution. It's like maybe less than a year, actually, where you had the ability to, in the views of the state, renounce your American citizenship and maintain your British citizenship. So I can tell, I think part of the issue here, and I'm imagining the perspective of the listener, and I'm like, I know that this is really complicated and it's thorny, and I think this is part of the problem, which is when you're trying to discuss early American citizenship and its understanding, and you're talking about probate law and how this state in this court, the New York Court of Chancery in 1844 acknowledged what looks like a kind of birthright citizenship for immigrants. But that wasn't the standard, for instance, in somewhere like Virginia, where the 1779 Constitution specifies a different standard for citizenship, where being born on Virginia soil had to come with having an American parent as well in order to acquire citizenship. So when you're talking about these distinctions at the time of the founding, it's complicated. These things are complicated. They're complex, thorny legal issues that are unclear. And to my mind, that's the problem, right? We have not gotten clear on who is a citizen. And the fact that the interpretation today relies on the 14th Amendment, which itself makes a reference to birth, I think is a problem. To my mind, the logical conclusion from the social compact theory and the idea of consent is that it needs to be an explicit conscious choice to become a citizen. Then it should be made by everyone, the citizen of even the children of citizens. And we need to be very clear about who it is that is really and truly subject to the jurisdiction of our laws, to use that language. But the bigger point is, it's obvious that foreigners, when they're here, have to obey American law. But it is by no means clear that their children should be admitted as citizens without any kind of any other decision process going on. And I think that in itself is clear, but also when you look at native-born, quote-unquote, citizens or the children of citizens, these too require, I think, conscious choice, explicit choice. We need to get clear on who owes what, and we should think more about that question. In my perspective, one of the questions I have here is the 14th Amendment's account of citizenship consistent with the founding? Kind of, but the fact that it makes reference to birth, again, I think is a problem. That's not a good standard. Birth should not be the standard. Consent should be the standard. The social compact, we should take that seriously. And you could say, one response might be just practical. How can we possibly have people give explicit consent for citizenship now? And I think it's actually not that difficult. The point is, there are lots of people take oaths all the time. They have to show up. We sign contracts all the time, right? If you're an American, you sign a contract with an insurance company, you sign a contract with your rental, with your landlord, with the mortgage company. You sign contracts for your, cell phone bill. All of those things are considered perfectly normal. And yet we have this view that joining the social compact by actually signing it and adopting it for yourself is this crazy, unimaginable thing. Like, how could we possibly do that? And my point is, I think it should be done that way. I think it would be very clarifying. Write down the social compact. What does it include? What are its terms, right? What are the powers of government, really and truly? I think sometimes this has been unclear, and some of this lack of clarity goes back to the founding itself. And my point here is not to attack the founders. By no means. They created the best regime that had existed up to that time in human history. But there's certainly some room for improvement or thinking here, because that regime has come apart under internal pressures, and that should give us pause. Like, well, maybe we should think clearly about how we can get our country back. And I actually want the best parts of the older American regime to be preserved, and they're not being preserved now. So that means we have to think clearly about first principles. One critique of, I guess the problem with tacit consent is it's murky. It's like, what was tacitly consented to? And moreover, does the person who tacitly consented know that they tacitly consented? Do they know what it is they owe? Are they clear? And moreover, when there's a lack of clarity about the social compact, then it's easier to abuse it, right? If the purpose of government is the protection of person and property, but you're not defining how that takes place, what happens is the left seizes power and then manipulates all of that language. They don't do this now, but they could if they wanted to. And well, I guess they do it in some ways. But you could say, if you take the founders' view, the preservation of life, liberty, and property, consent of the governed. And Democrats could say, or leftists could say, because you live in America, you tacitly consented to whatever it is that we want to do because we're now in power. And moreover, defense of person of life, liberty, and property means that we need a massive welfare state, and we need to have an interventionist foreign policy that promotes gay race communism abroad. And I don't think that follows from what the founders meant. I don't think it follows from the logic of our regime. But the point is, you can make those arguments, right? You can say those words. You can claim to be an inheritor of the founding while completely and radically altering the meaning of the words at the heart of the American regime. Why? Because there's a lack of clarity on what that meaning was. You didn't specify clearly what it is that we're supposed to be doing in our own time. And you can say, look, you can always have abuse of language, right? You can always have people who are going to, they're going to divert from the core point or the central purpose. But it's harder to do that if you keep it in mind and you make it clear what the real obligations are and who is owed them. So there's no substitute for the virtue of the people. There's no substitute for education in the moral dimension of the regime. But there's also a good place for stating clearly what the purpose of the institutions are. Institutions educate, right? Our understanding of citizenship has an educative function. And when it's done by tacit consent, the result of that is to educate people in the idea that consent isn't important enough to write down what it is we're supposed to be doing. And so because you've shrouded the question, you've just accepted that people stumble into citizenship, should you be surprised when their understanding of citizenship degrades and even comes to oppose the real purposes that existed at the founding? I'm not surprised by that. And again, some of this is understandable. At the time of the founding, you had the question over slavery. That was raising, so that raises a real question over what it is the American regime is supposed to be doing. It's obviously a contradiction to the principle that all men are created equal. Okay, but it also exists. So how do you untangle this complex question over slavery in the midst of trying to create a union that will preserve the rights of all other Americans, free Americans? How do you think through this problem? How do you create a political regime rightly that does justice? It's going to mean that some things are not perfect. You're always dealing with real problems. But I think one problem with arguments about political prudence is that it's easy to then use that as an excuse not to think about principle. Well, a thing is hard, so we can't do it. No. Just because something is difficult just because a problem is difficult, just because a procedure is difficult, doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It means you need to think clearly about what the real difficulties are and how to address them. So, one counter argument to what I'm saying here now about consent is that it's, is the social compact theory destructive of real community? If everything is choice, instead of, being born, blood, flesh, the soil, if you replace that with choice, are you disintegrating the foundations of real community, which are built in tradition, birth, and inheritance, and a historical existence? And my argument is no. I don't think that's the case at all. And the reason for that is you can adopt a tradition for yourself. You can choose to make a thing real for yourself. That's the whole premise behind contract. And this is most clear, you can see this very clearly in marriage, right? The idea that you're taking on a real obligation, you're binding yourself to it, and you'll follow through. Now, we don't take the marriage contract seriously today at all, but I don't think the solution to that question is to get rid of contract and choice, if that makes sense. That one of the core elements of the American regime is not simply membership in a specific ethnic group or a specific tradition. We have a revolutionary founding grounded in choice, and that's a part of who we are as a people. And sometimes what happens on the right is there's a longing to return to some other form of self-understanding. It's especially popular to look at older European forms of nationhood and identity. But America isn't Europe. And we have a different founding and a different history. And we have different principles at the heart of our regime. And I think a lot of times this all gets... People jumble together, I've seen this online and among scholars, they'll jumble together the idea of consent with the left-wing social project, that one leads to the other. That if you allow people to make choices and to be free, the end result is gay race communism or Marxism. That if you have democracy in elections, for instance, the end result will be socialism. I think these arguments are ultimately flawed. I don't think that's correct. I think you certainly, the question of choice is striking, and it draws us to the core questions immediately. You really have to, you can't just inherit, well, there's a common law tradition, you need to subordinate yourself to that because you're born owing allegiance to whoever's in power. The American regime is grounded on an entirely different foundation that does not go together. The historical understandings of citizenship and being subject does not work in the American context. And I really don't think tacit consent works either in the American context. It was tried. That was the standard for most of our history. It's the standard now. The problem is, these things blend together, and soon you lose a sense of what it is that governments are supposed to be doing. And I keep coming back to this point. But, I have a similar question here. Does the social compact require open borders? No, it does not. You can exclude people from membership, right? You can allow them from membership as well. That's a real question. At the time of the founding, the Naturalization Act of 1790 and 95 established that only free white persons of good character could become citizens. Well, Congress changed that later. We have changed our definition of citizenship. But the point is, we can change it again. We can change it again, and we probably, and I would say we certainly need to do that now. We need to get clear on who is a member and who is not, and moreover, who should be a member and who should not. My view is that immigration from the global south into the United States from 1965 onward has been a disaster. The increasing wave of migration from these places has resulted in an abandonment of the fundamental principles of the American regime. We've abandoned our views of private property, of personal freedom. We've abandoned our sense of what it is to be an American, our spiritedness, our view of the consent of the governed. We've abandoned our traditional norms regarding jury trials, regarding legislatures and laws. We've replaced the older consent Republican system with an administrative system that ignores consent and relies on expertise and credentialism. It is no accident that as we have lost our older sense of who we are, we've also seen massive demographic changes within the regime itself. This is a real problem. And in my view, to the preservation of the social compact, the preservation of private property, the preservation of limited government requires that we have a stringent understanding of who should and should not be a citizen. And I don't think it is necessary for any regime to analyze each case individually. It is entirely legitimate to use shorthand, to use a heuristic, to say, look, individuals from this country have consistently not made for good citizens. And there may be exceptions to that rule, but the point is, when you're guiding a country and trying to figure out how to make policy, you have to make policy for the general condition. And sometimes that means saying, look, we're not going to be considering individual cases. We're going to have a blanket rule. It's okay, because it's our country. It's our property. If I have a blanket rule that no one is allowed to come onto my land, that's fine. It's my property. I'm allowed to say that. The same token, a nation that owns its borders, the corporate entity that represents the people, created by their free consent, that entity too, in a sane regime, you would give that government, that political regime, control over the ports of entry. It would own a property right, very literally in the border of the nation, and therefore has a right to exclude individuals from crossing that line, right? Because part of its duty is protection. And the definition of you're joining, not only the citizen is not only joining the political regime, he's joining his property to the regime as well. He's creating a real country, a real sovereignty. One question that comes up in this is free choice possible? Is it possible to have real consent? One argument I hear relatively frequently is that there's always coercion. There's coercion everywhere and always. So free choice isn't possible, and so talking about consent is it's really actually a kind of myth. And I reject that interpretation. For one, you'll get people say things like nature coerces human beings. I don't think that's true at all. Nature, the non-human, the things that cannot be otherwise, the operation of the material world is how this would typically be understood. It doesn't have a will. So nature does not coerce us. It doesn't put a gun to our heads. The fact that we'll die if we don't eat is a natural fact. But it isn't oppression that nature requires us to eat in order to live. Because nature doesn't have a moral will. It isn't imposing on us for some malicious purpose or even some beneficial purpose. It just is, right? And you can argue about this because you can talk about God and theology, but then you're talking about the supernatural and God's purpose for the universe. And that, I believe, is a matter of faith. And it's separate from the question of just ordinary perception that, if you drop something from a height, it will fall. That's not oppression, right? If I jump off of a roof, I will fall to the ground. Nature didn't coerce me. It isn't being cruel by, gravity isn't being cruel to me because it operates on my body everywhere I go. It just is. It's a fact. Human beings, by contrast, can be coercive. And coercion is pretty obvious. You put a gun to someone's head and you threaten them. You threaten them with pain. I'm going to inflict pain on you unless you do what I want. That is coercive. But not all relations between human beings are coercive in that sense. Sometimes, in many cases, they're peaceful and productive. They're really made out of consent, out of real free choice by both parties. You say, look, a really good example is, just ordinary business life is this way. I was sitting in my favorite restaurant recently. It's a pizza shop. And, customers are coming in and out. They offer up money. They get pizza. Right? There's no fraud taking place. The customer isn't putting a gun to the head of the owner. The owner isn't putting a gun to the head of the customers. People are choosing to go there. They're getting something they want. Everyone's benefiting here, right? Everyone's better off. The employees are better off. They get money that they need in order to live and to buy the things they want. The customers get something that they want to enjoy, and they have a date night or whatever else. So my point is, it's easy. That's very clearly that you can have real and meaningful consent. Anyway, I think it's. This may be. I'm going to end there. I'm going to end on that topic. The point is, we have the ability to have free consent. There is the possibility of having real free choice. We should have explicit consent in our regime. We need to adopt that principle more clearly. And I think regardless of what happens with the Supreme Court, regardless of what happens with the law, we need to be thinking about this question for the future. So in some sense, I'm not hanging my hat on whatever happens at the Supreme Court. I certainly hope Trump wins. I think the arguments made by conservative legal scholars like John Eastman and Ed Erler and the arguments made by Trump himself, they're correct. And those arguments should prevail. But the real political questions are deeper, and they're worth engaging with seriously. Anyway, I think this is a good place to close, and it's a topic we can come back to again in the future. But I want to thank you all for listening here today. And I want to encourage you to follow me on X at @JLippincott. You can also follow me at Regime Critic, my Substack, and you can find this podcast, Lippincott Talk, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Thank you again for listening. I can't wait to see you next time.